Welcome, everyone. My name is Cassidy Diamond. I am the Associate Director of Public Programs and Events here at the International Documentary Association. Thank you for joining us for this conversation around My Name is Pauli Murray, moderated by Crooked Media's Shaniqua McClendo. Very excited to have you all. Before we begin, I would like to offer a brief land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you today from Chicago, which is on the unceded land of the Potawatomi people, who have been stewards of this land for generations. I would also like to thank our media sponsor, IndieWire, for helping to bring the series to you all this year. You can find the rest of the series, a couple more months left, at documentary.org/screenings-series. And without any further ado, I'm going to bring on Shaniqua here to get our conversation started. Welcome, Shaniqua.
Hi, thank you for having me. Really good to see you as always, and I'm really excited to jump into the conversation about this film today. I won't take too long jumping into it. I just have to start off by saying I don't know the word, but I think upset that I did not know who Paulie Murray was before I watched this documentary. I am from North Carolina, and so that hit even harder. But I'm really happy I got the opportunity to watch it and share it with some folks, and really excited to talk to our two panelists today, who are Betsy West and Julie Cohen, who are the directors of the film. So I'd like to welcome them to the stage right now. Hi.
Hi there.
Hi,
great to be here.
Great to have you. And we can just jump right in. But as I was saying before, thank you for making this film. It was amazing. I started talking to some of my friends from North Carolina after I watched it. And a couple of them had recently learned of Paulie, but one of my friends said he's from Durham and he got, I think it was a college scholarship in Paulie's honor. So he knew about her, but yeah, just thank you. So many great things in it. And I guess one question I'd love to start off with is, before you all started making this film, how much did each of you know about Paulie Murray, if anything at all?
Not very much. I mean, we basically learned about Pauli Murray from Ruth Bader Ginsburg when we were making our documentary RBG. And, in the context of Paulie's work on, the legal thinking behind fighting for women's equality, gender equality. As you saw in the film, RBG gives credit to Paulie with coming up with the innovative idea of using the 14th Amendment to win equal rights. It really wasn't until after the film aired that we looked into Paulie's background and were just blown away by what we learned.
I'll just, it was really towards the end of our RBG edit that we learned this slice of Paulie Murray's story, and in the process of, going around doing Q&As, as you do after a film, some people ask us like, oh, RBG story is so incredible, like whose shoulders did RBG stand on? And that question really prompted us to do a little more research into Paulie Murray, and we discovered whoa, it wasn't just women's rights, it was these innovative ideas in the civil rights movement that Murray came up with, as well as the labor movement work, the poetry, the Episcopal priesthood, academia, so many areas of sort of innovative thought and breakthroughs that we kind of almost couldn't believe it. And that's kind of what set us into looking further into Paulie Murray's story.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I will try not to go too much, but it was just such a great film. And I think you can see that you all, as you put it together, learned a lot, and you shared a lot of that with us. My next question, I'm sure you've gotten several times, but I'm sure our audience would probably love to know just how you got access to everything that you had in the film. Watching it, and I could be wrong, so correct me, it seemed like everything that Paulie left were written documents. And so I'm just wondering how you got access to all of the audio and the video footage that you included in the film.
Well, actually, Paulie, who did save a lot of written documents, also saved many of those audio tapes that you hear because Paulie was interviewed a number of times toward the end of Paulie's life for oral histories. Students and others who were looking into Paulie's background, having become the first female-identified African-American Episcopal priest, they would come to interview Paulie or about Paulie's work in feminist legal thinking. And Paulie would push the button, record on the tape recorder, and save it. So this was part of the incredible collection that Paulie left posthumously to the Schlesinger Library at Harvard and made sure that it got there, 141 boxes. I mean, when we first learned about Paulie, we had no idea whether or not we could make a documentary about someone who had passed away almost 35 years before, but it was really thanks to Paulie's foresight and sense of history and determination to leave a mark that we were able to do this.
The existence of all this paper and all these audio tapes was quite intentional on Paulie Murray's part. In some ways, it's just another way that Paulie was so prescient, just thinking through like, okay, so maybe society isn't ready for me now, but at some point people are going to be ready and want to see and hear and read this story, and I want to leave the materials that make that possible.
Yeah, yeah. This leads literally right into my next question. So as I mentioned before, everything in the film was very new to me. But, you know, at the beginning, I was like, man, why don't I know this story? But by the time I got to the end, it was very clear that Paulie knew that, you know, their story needed to be told and it needed to be out there. And that's why all of this documentation was left. But if the approach wasn't to leave all of this for, you know, like two people like you to find and put this film together, and there wasn't that level of intention there, do you think we would have heard this story the way that we heard it? And I guess, you know, how would you have been able to tell this story if not for all of that information?
Well, first of all, I think we want to make clear that we're not the people who discovered Paulie Murray. I mean, yes. There's been quite a bit of serious scholarship done about Paulie by academics, many women's studies, gender studies, mostly African-American women academics who have been digging into Paulie's story. And also Paulie was covered a little bit more. Paulie's activist activities were covered by the African-American press in the 1930s and the 1940s. So there was a record there. Certainly for a, for print exploration. And when you look at the contributions that Paulie made to the women's movement and to the civil rights movement, to Thurgood Marshall's arguments in Brown v. Board of Education, I think that some of this would have come out, but perhaps not as much as has recently happened, because Paulie was so determined to save the story.
Yeah. And how did that impact how you all approach the film, having, you know, Paulie's own words and kind of recollection of all the things that had happened in their lives?
Yeah, I mean, the existence of the audio tapes and then eventually some video that we found of Paulie Murray that was not in the main collection were huge for us. And in fact, I don't think we would have made this film without them. It would have been too hard to tell the story in documentary form. Again, completely intentional. Our understanding from Patricia Bell Scott, the consulting producer on the film, who wrote a book about sort of a dual biography of Paulie Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt called The Firebrand and the First Lady, and was in touch with Paulie Murray over the years, was that Paulie actually had the specific idea of a film being made, a biography of Paulie Murray. So, you know, there was some real thought behind saving these, you know, there was more than 40 hours of recorded audio of Paulie's voice. That would be a lot even for a much more like documented person in life. So that's pretty incredible stuff, and great planning and thinking about what materials might be necessary to tell someone's life story by Paulie Murray.
Is there anything in or not in the film that was the most interesting thing that you stumbled upon going through all of this?
You know, I think that we were really taken with Paulie's private life and, you know, both the struggle with gender identity at a time when, you know, there was no language, there was no community, there was, you know, this was a private issue largely for Paulie. And also the discovery that Paulie did find personal happiness in a love story with Renee Barlow, which kind of, in some ways, you know, made us feel good that that Paulie really did, whether or not resolve these issues, found a level of personal contentment. You know, that was in some ways a discovery.
Yeah, yeah. Betsy, did you have anything you wanted to add?
We wanted this to be a sort of personal and joyful film in a lot of ways. I mean, there's so much in Paulie's story that's in the film that's amazing. Truthfully, it's like the tip of the iceberg. There are many chapters of Paulie Murray's story that we didn't cover in the film. That's always kind of true in a documentary, but it's really true in this one. There were, you know, we sort of tried to create, you know, as a story arc from the strongest materials in the audio, but there's so many chapters of Paulie Murray's life, being the first Black Deputy Attorney General of the state of California, doing really fascinating work trying to stop, and ultimately not succeeding, to stop a death penalty sentence in a case of a sharecropper convicted of murder in the late 30s, a project that Paulie Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt were both involved in, creating a book that was like a compendium of all segregation laws in the United States in the 1940s and 50s. You know, just an unbelievable number of accomplishments. And the book Proud Shoes, the family memoir that we briefly mentioned in the film, is just an unbelievable work of personal history in a style that really hadn't been written, as far as we know, before Paulie wrote that book in the late 50s. So, you know, this is a person who will just blow you away at every turn.
So something else, you all just kind of touched on Paulie's personal life, and also her just kind of path, and sometimes a struggle to understand her identity, her gender identity and sexuality. Do you think that if Paulie didn't leave, you know, all of these documents, you know, audio and video footage, that their story might look very different now? And if their queer identity would have been included in what we understand, or who we understand Paulie to be, especially thinking about how, you know, even now queer people are still trying to find their way in our society. And this was decades ago, when not only was there not language, but you would literally be shunned for these things. Do you think that part of her story would be so prevalent if they didn't leave all of that information behind?
Yeah, no, I think that Paulie, as Julie said, Paulie was very intentional about what Paulie left in the Schlesinger Library. Our producer, Talea Bridges McMahon, spent a lot of time in that library going through some of the boxes, and the collection is curated. I mean, there are some pages of diaries that are ripped out, giving you the sense that the material that Paulie left behind, whether or not it's the letters to doctors inquiring about testosterone treatment, letters to Aunt Pauline talking about this identity struggle, that these were deliberately left so that future generations would find them. And I think, yeah, it would have been possible. Paulie did not write about any of this publicly in Paulie's lifetime, because it would have been dangerous, frankly. I mean, you lose your job for this. In the 50s, during the lavender scare of the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, this was not something, you know, gender identity was not something that was publicly discussed. But it seems very clear to us that Paulie left this evidence behind pretty deliberately so that people in the future could benefit from it.
Yeah. Something else that stood out in the film, just thinking about kind of who Paulie grew up to be, was her Aunt Pauline. And I was really struck by the story about wearing dresses. And she, told Paulie, okay, you can wear pants all week, but when you go to church, you have to wear dresses. How central do you think being raised by her Aunt Pauline was to who she was able to, who they were able to grow up and be?
Yeah, I mean, we think Aunt Pauline is absolutely central to who Paulie Murray became, because when you think about it, there were so many instances in Paulie's life where, obstacles, rejection, rank racism, hatred, sexism, like Paulie was facing that kind of thing again and again in a way that would crush a lot of people, kind of rightly so. But like at Paulie's core was some real self-confidence and self-love that came, the way that it can come in a family when someone's raising you who completely believes in you and accepts everything you are. Like, yes, Aunt Pauline wanted Paulie to go along with societal rules and was not going to tolerate like showing up for church in a pair of pants. Like that wasn't going to go over. But like there's communication between them where Aunt Pauline is referring to Paulie's, as my little boy girl. Like just a complete sense of like, I know you, I see you, and I still love you. And that gave Paulie, it wasn't just Paulie's brilliance, it was like a core of sort of certainty that was really necessary, we think, for Paulie to kind of push through despite like so many challenges.
Yeah. Betsy, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think that this was something that we discovered in the course of doing the film, the importance of Aunt Pauline to Paulie's life. And I totally agree with Julie. She was central.
Yeah. Do you think that if Paulie's story, was better known sooner, do you think that would have had a larger or an impact at all on, let me ask this question again. What impact do you think earlier awareness of Paulie's story might have had on the queer community, and just even the civil rights fights that we've seen over the past decades? Just if people understood who Paulie was, or just at least known. And in the film we see, I guess there's like some kind of event happening and someone speaking about a queer and trans identity. And you can just see the emotion that's there talking about Paulie. And so I guess what I'm trying to ask is, if more people knew about Paulie, do you think that there maybe would have been earlier acceptance of the queer community?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I think, you're talking about Dolores Chandler, who, yes, when a trans man who, when they discovered Paulie, was just first so angry to have not known. And now, like so many other people in the LGBTQ community, sees Paulie as a kind of beacon. So if people had that example of someone so accomplished, so significant in our history, who also, was gender non-binary, that might have provided a lot of encouragement. It's speculation, and how early are we talking about? There's a point at which, I'm not sure society would have been ready for this information, in the 1950s or the 1960s, when there just wasn't even understanding of homosexuality, or up into the 80s or the 90s. I mean, look at how recent this is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think, the understanding of the huge role that all varieties of queer people have played in American history would be like just a great way of expanding our understanding of how things have unfolded in our country, just as, and this is probably sort of represents a lot of things in the way we study history, just as we need a better understanding of the role that women and women-identified people played in the civil rights movement, and that people of color played in the women's rights movement. Like at every turn, like Paulie was sort of being sliced and diced out of history, and like sort of being part of a larger process to refocus on Paulie feels like, kind of maybe the part of a corrective to that loss.
This may feel like a question I've already asked you, but I specifically want to kind of ask it in this frame. Going through the film, you see that like Paulie knew or interacted with so many Americans that are held in such high esteem. The Eleanor Roosevelt relationship. I was just really taken aback that she just started writing. And I interned in the Office of Presidential Correspondence, so I mean I know times have changed, but the thought of like I help process letters, and so the thought of the First Lady getting a letter, writing back, but then continuing to have this correspondence that turns into a friendship was just, I mean, quite bizarre to me. But I guess it made sense at the time. But you even see that she did a program with James Baldwin, and supported Ruth Bader Ginsburg's work. And I'm just wondering how Paulie could have interacted, had friendships with such well-known people and still not be well-known themselves. I just can't like piece that together for some reason.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question because Paulie really was close to some very powerful and important people. And yet, as you say, didn't get the same recognition that those people have now. And it's a complicated question. As Julie said, it was sexism in the civil rights movement and racism in the women's rights movement. And I also think it's a little bit of a function of the way Paulie operated. Paulie was an activist ahead of the time, a brilliant legal strategist for the civil rights movement ahead of the time, and then moved on to the women's rights movement. I mean, it's almost as if Paulie didn't stick around in any one area long enough to get the recognition. Paulie had moved on to some other groundbreaking mission that Paulie had, winding up with spirituality and involvement in religion. So, I don't discount the sexism and racism aspect, but I also do think there's a part of just the way Paulie lived life.
No, I think that's spot on, because it seemed like the purpose of their work wasn't to get all of this attention. It was to have an impact. And, kind of the seeds were planted, and then I will let you all, nurture the plants, and I'm going to go do handle these other problems. As you mentioned, Betsy, Paulie was ahead of their time in everything from, a lot of kind of legal scholarship that we, quite frankly, take for granted now, from the busing incident, which just every story that was mentioned and the way you all had it framed of 10 years before this, 15 years before this, was really helpful. And so I think, from your film, Paulie's autobiography and other books that have been written about Paulie help tell like a very full story, but kind of like an isolated story. How do you think we can truly integrate Paulie's story into the way that we understand American history that isn't off to the side, but is as central as, when we hear about Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King Jr.?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. I think part of it is delving in maybe more than because as you say, this is like, if you do think of Paulie Murray as being a figure like the central figures in American history, then you realize like, oh, seeing one film like isn't really going to do it. You have to learn, there's so much reading that one would have to do about Abraham Lincoln before you started to feel like you had a sense of all the impact that he had. I mean, one thing we're eager for our film to do is to start people reading some of the amazing books that have been written by and about Paulie, not to mention, Paulie's poetry, which often is not only kind of poignant and evocative, but has this like big sweep of rethinking American history, is incredible. And in some ways, we feel like would be a very good starting point for like understanding like not just Paulie's biography, but how Paulie's story interweaves with with American history from, going back centuries. Dark Testament is the book of poetry, which actually has been reissued recently, and it's a slim book, but it's like very expansive in your mind. So I guess I don't even know how you'd begin teaching such a thing, but I think reading Paulie's words is a first step.
I think it's kind of heartening that anecdotally we have found that younger people have started to learn about Paulie Murray. When we were working on the film and we might mention it to someone, if they were over age 40, forget about it. They'd never heard about Paulie Murray. But often younger students, college students, did know about Paulie. And the curators at the Schlesinger Library told us when we were there, this is a library that is the repository of the archives of some of the most well-known and famous American women, whether or not it's Betty Friedan or, Julia Child or Susan B. Anthony letters. At this library, the most requested archive now is Paulie Murray.
Wow.
And so I think that is
Not sure
what did I say? Anyway, I think that's an encouraging sign that a younger generation is eager and hungry to hear this story. Should we say this? Should we do this again? I guess maybe because we weren't moving.
Yeah, we weren't moving around.
We weren't moving around. Those lights? Okay,
Yeah.
I'll just jump in where I jumped in after you finish. I say, the one thing that we have found anecdotally is that younger people do seem to know about Paulie Murray. When we were working on the film and we would tell people the name, if the person was over 40 years old, generally they had no idea who we were talking about. But college students, recent college students, seem to have heard the name, and this was kind of backed up by the curators at the Schlesinger Library, which is the repository of the archives of many of the most famous American women, and yet the archive that is most requested in the past year or so has been Paulie Murray. Younger people are really eager to learn Paulie's story.
Yeah. Well, that makes me really excited. And I have to say that I am really excited to learn more about Paulie now. And I will start reading her poetry because I love poetry and can be really, really insightful for folks. Well, I just want to thank both of you again, Julie and Betsy, for joining us today. I think this has been a wonderful conversation, and just, again, very grateful for you all putting this film together and helping to continuing the conversation and understanding of who Paulie Murray is. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Shaniqua.
Thank you so much.